February 2, 1943. The final German radio broadcast from Stalingrad fell silent. 300,000 soldiers of the Sixth Army were killed or taken prisoner. In Berlin, in the command centers scattered across the Eastern Front, German officers processed the scale of the catastrophe. The biggest German force ever surrounded, annihilated. A disaster. Definitely a pivotal moment, maybe. But in the icy logic of strategic preparation, many believed this indicated a halt. The Russians had depleted themselves in the savage winter battles. They would require months to recuperate, to reconstruct, to organize for the subsequent stage. The Red Army struck 6 days afterward. On February 8th, Soviet troops assaulted toward Kursk and Kharkov, pushing west with a rage that surprised German leaders entirely unprepared. The cold season campaign that had ensnared Sixth Army at Stalingrad hadn't concluded. It had scarcely stopped. While German staff personnel were still handling lost documents from the Volga, Soviet armored groups were already speeding across the frozen plains, utilizing breaches created by the Stalingrad mission. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, leading Army Group South, observed the circumstances worsen with increasing concern. Soviet troops were progressing 30 to 40 miles daily in certain areas. Whole German units diminished by months of frigid combat merely disintegrated under the strain. Manstein had witnessed Russian assaults previously. This was unique. The synchronization, the extent, the persistence. He dispatched critical communications to Hitler's base. The Soviets weren't halting. They weren't strengthening. They were approaching. In his base near Zaporizhzhia, Manstein examined reconnaissance data that defied logic according to all German strategies had presumed. Soviet detachments that ought to have been broken were attacking at complete power. Tank battalions that should have been lacking gasoline were penetrating far into German rear zones. Infantry groups that should have been too fatigued to advance were trekking through snowstorms to sever German withdrawal paths. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of German military reconnaissance for the Eastern Front, gathered the figures. They were astonishing. Soviet troops that had recently finished the Stalingrad siege were already involved in fresh actions hundreds of miles distant. Units spotted at Stalingrad in January were now emerging near Kharkov in February. The supply chain alone should have been unfeasible. German armies required weeks to reposition after significant missions. The Soviets were accomplishing it in days. Manstein sought approval to perform a combative pullback, to exchange territory for time, to set up a protectable boundary before the spring melt. Hitler denied. Every inch of soil had to be maintained, every town protected to the final soldier. Manstein understood what that signified. More sieges, more calamities, more forces obliterated attempting to retain locations that couldn't be retained. By mid-February, Soviet troops had freed Kursk and were nearing Kharkov, Ukraine's second biggest metropolis. German leaders in the town could hear the cannon fire approaching closer each evening, the roar coming in from the east, unending now, a rhythm that never ceased. SS General Paul Hauser, directing the SS Panzer Corps in Kharkov, confronted a decision. Follow Hitler's directive to secure the city and be surrounded like Sixth Army at Stalingrad, or withdraw and risk trial. On February 15th, Hauser commanded his troops to leave Kharkov. He selected endurance over compliance. Soviet soldiers entered the metropolis the following day. It was the initial occasion a German officer had publicly ignored Hitler's hold firm command and survived to recount it. The example horrified the Supreme Command. If officers could merely retreat when endangered, the whole protective plan fell apart. But if they complied and perished in position, there would be no officers remaining. Manstein observed the Soviet progress with a specialist's gaze, searching for the instance of overreach. Every assault ultimately surpassed its provisions, revealed its sides, generated chances for counterstrike. The Soviets had thrust 400 miles west from Stalingrad in 6 weeks. Their logistic chains were strained thin. Their vanguards were hurrying ahead of their foot soldiers. The spring melt was arriving, which would convert the plains into impassable sludge. There had to be a fracture point. He discovered it near Kharkov. In late February, Manstein initiated a counter-assault with his panzer backups, hitting at the overstretched Soviet vanguards. The third clash of Kharkov turned into a masterpiece of fluid combat. German panzer units, employing their better tactical expertise in the remaining of their winter movement, surrounded and annihilated several Soviet tank corps. By mid-March, German troops had recaptured Kharkov. The Soviet winter campaign halted in the spring, mud. In Berlin, the triumph was hailed as evidence that German weapons could still prevail. Hitler elevated Manstein. Propaganda asserted the emergency had ended, but in the silence of his base, Manstein composed evaluations that narrated a different tale. Yes, he had secured a tactical success. Yes, he had steadied the front. But the overall situation was disastrous. The Soviets had shifted the front line 200 miles west. They had freed enormous regions. They had shown functional abilities that German reconnaissance had claimed they didn't have. And most disturbing of all, they had achieved it right after Stalingrad, without the break that every military doctrine said they required. Manstein's reconnaissance officers assembled the information from the winter drive. Soviet troops had dedicated 160 divisions to the post-Stalingrad attacks. 160? Where had they originated? German reconnaissance had monitored Soviet placements throughout the Stalingrad fight. These weren't the identical units. These were new divisions completely outfitted that had materialized as if from nowhere. Either German reconnaissance had totally failed to identify huge Soviet backups, or Soviet manufacturing and recruitment abilities were far past anything formerly calculated. The reality was both. In April 1943, as the spring thaw transformed the Eastern Front into a sea of mud and both sides halted to reorganize, German officers started receiving reconnaissance reports that basically questioned their grasp of Soviet strengths. Heinz Guderian, the panzer innovator, who had recently been named Inspector General of Panzer Troops, examined manufacturing estimates with rising skepticism. Soviet tank output in 1942 had surpassed 20,000 units. 20,000. German output that same year had been under 10,000. The proportion was 2.1, and it was expanding. Guderian had spent the prior year in shame, after Hitler dismissed him from command for executing an unsanctioned pullback. Now assigned with reconstructing Germany's panzer forces, he faced calculations that rendered his task almost unachievable. Even if German output doubled, even if every fresh tank went to the Eastern Front, the Soviets would still be manufacturing more. And Soviet tanks weren't the primitive, unreliable devices of 1941 anymore. The T-34 had developed into a powerful weapon. The new heavy tanks, the KV-85s, and the prototypes of what would become the IS-2 outmatched anything in the German inventory. Guderian shared his discoveries with Hitler in a sequence of meetings that spring. The Führer rejected them. Soviet production numbers were inflated. Russian tanks were substandard. German superiority would surmount Russian volume. Guderian, who had seen his panzer divisions drain pale in Russia, knew otherwise. Superiority counted in tactical clashes, but when you were outmanned 3-1, when the adversary could replenish losses quicker than you could cause them, superiority became meaningless. The German High Command organized Operation Citadel for the summer of 1943. The goal was to sever the Kursk salient, a Soviet-controlled protrusion in the German lines, surround the protecting forces, and reinstate German strategic drive. It would be the final major German assault in the East. Every accessible panzer division was assigned. New Tiger and Panther tanks were hurried to the front. Elite Waffen SS divisions were gathered for the penetration. Hitler postponed the assault multiple times, awaiting more new tanks, more readiness, more assurance of victory. The postponement was deadly. Soviet reconnaissance knew about Citadel nearly from the instant German planning started. Agents in Switzerland deciphered German messages, questionings of captives, aerial scouting. The details streamed to Moscow in a constant flow. Stalin and his generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky made a choice that would have been inconceivable 2 years prior. They would permit the Germans to strike. They would arrange defenses, may in depth soak up the German onslaught, then initiate counter-assaults that would ruin German offensive capacity eternally. The Kursk salient became the most densely fortified spot in military records. Soviet builders created 8 defensive layers, some positions 50 miles deep. They placed over 1 million mines. They excavated thousands of miles of ditches, constructed concrete shelters, located anti-tank guns in overlapping fire zones. They shifted artillery ahead until there were more cannons per mile of front than in any conflict in history. And they gathered reserves, enormous reserves, tank armies, rifle armies, whole fronts kept back from the starting defenses, waiting to counter-strike once the German assault depleted itself. German scouting identified the fortifications. Reconnaissance officers noted the defensive setups, but the magnitude was so immense that many German leaders simply didn't accept the reports. Colonel Galen's reconnaissance staff approximated Soviet power in the Kursk salient at 1.3 million men. The real number was nearer to 1.9 million. Galen approximated 3,000 Soviet tanks in the salient. The actual count surpassed 5,000. At every stage, German reconnaissance undervalued Soviet strength because acknowledging the accurate numbers meant admitting that the assault was condemned before it commenced. Operation Citadel started on July 5, 1943. Within hours, German leaders realized something was disastrously incorrect. The Soviets weren't caught off guard. They had known precisely where and when the strike would occur. German artillery setup, the huge barrage intended to weaken Soviet defenses, struck vacant spots. The Soviets had withdrawn from their forward ditches, allowing German shells to detonate in deserted terrain. When German armor proceeded, they encountered defenses that had been specially readied to halt them. Anti-tank ditches too broad for tanks to traverse, minefields that directed armor into death traps, packed anti-tank gun spots that could engage at distances beyond a German tank gun's useful range. The Battle of Kursk became a wearing-down horror. German panzer divisions that had anticipated breaking through in hours found themselves inching forward meters at a time, suffering crippling losses for slight advances. The new Panther tanks, pushed into service before their technical issues were resolved, failed mechanically faster than they were destroyed. Tiger tanks, almost invincible from the front, were overwhelmed by Soviet anti-tank squads who assaulted from the flanks and rear. German foot soldiers trailing the armor perished in the minefields and in the crossing fields of machine gun fire. On July 12th, the southern pincer of the German assault reached the small village of Prokhorovka. There, SS Panzer Corps, the cream of the German armored force, clashed with Soviet 5th Guards tank army in what became the biggest tank battle in history. Over 800 tanks clashed in a turbulent chaos that endured all day. Soviet tanks, outnumbered and outgunned, closed to close quarters range where German armor benefits vanished. They collided with German tanks, shot into engine areas, gave themselves up to eliminate Tigers and Panthers. By dusk, the battlefield was a smoldering cemetery of charred armor from both sides, but the Soviets could bear the losses. Germany couldn't. General Walter Model, leading the northern pincer of the Citadel offensive, informed Hitler on July 10th that his troops had advanced only 6 miles into Soviet defenses and could proceed no further. His panzer divisions were battle ineffective. reduced to 30 or 40 functional tanks each. Soviet counterstrikes were intensifying. Model, one of Hitler's most bold commanders, suggested terminating the offensive. Manstein, directing the southern pincer, thought he could still accomplish a breakthrough if additional forces were dispatched. But there were no additional forces. And on July the 12th, the same day as Prokhorovka, the Soviets started their own offensive, Operation Kutuzov, against the Ural salient north of Kursk. Fresh Soviet armies, the backups that German reconnaissance had failed to spot, hit German positions with crushing power. Model's Ninth Army, already weakened by the Kursk offensive, now had to protect against a Soviet penetration effort in its rear. Hitler terminated Operation Citadel on July 13th. The last German strategic assault in the east had collapsed after 8 days, but the catastrophe was just starting. On July 17th, Soviet troops initiated Operation Rumyantsev, a vast counteroffensive against the southern side of the Kursk salient. On August 3rd, they began Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev against Kharkov. The city that Manstein had reclaimed in March, the emblem of German endurance, fell to the Soviets on August 23rd. This time, there would be no counterstrike to reclaim it. This time, it was gone permanently. Across the whole Eastern Front from the Baltic to the Black Sea, Soviet troops attacked. The strategic control had transferred to the Red Army, and it would never revert to Germany. German officers, seeing their meticulously prepared protective lines crumble, their fluid reserves ruined, their panzer divisions diminished to remnants, faced a new truth. The Soviets weren't just progressing, they were speeding up. Each assault was bigger than the previous, better organized, more destructive. Guderian, checking panzer divisions withdrawn from the front for restoration, found units that existed only in documents. Divisions with fewer than 30 operational tanks, battalions shrunk to company size, veteran crews deceased, replaced by youths with weeks of instruction. He informed Hitler that at existing loss rates, German armored forces would stop existing as an effective combat power within 6 months. Hitler replied by requiring more tanks, more assaults, more successes. The divide between the Führer's requirements and combat reality had become insurmountable. In September 1943, German troops retreated across the Dnieper River, forsaking Ukraine east of the river. The Dnieper was supposed to be an unbreakable protective line, a natural obstacle where German troops could finally secure the front. Soviet troops forced crossings within days. By November, they had set up bridgeheads on the western bank. By December, they were advancing toward Kiev. The capital of Ukraine, lost in September 1941, was freed on November 6, 1943. German reconnaissance officers compiling post-battle reports from the summer and fall campaigns recorded a Soviet military that had no similarity to the force Germany had invaded in 1941. Soviet operations now included advanced synchronization between multiple fronts, deep strategic planning, huge gatherings of artillery and armor at penetration points, and mobile units that exploited victories with a velocity that equaled or surpassed German operational pace. The Red Army had absorbed German tactics, modified them, and in many instances enhanced them. More alarming were the manufacturing figures. Soviet tank output in 1943 exceeded 24,000 vehicles. German output that year hit 12,000. The ratio had grown to 2.1. Soviet aircraft manufacturing was even more unbalanced. Over 34,000 combat planes emerged from Soviet plants in 1943 compared to fewer than 25,000 German planes. And Soviet output was still rising while German output battled under Allied airstrikes and material deficits. General Kurt Seitzler, chief of the German General Staff, presented these numbers to Hitler in a series of increasingly frantic sessions. The arithmetic of wearing down were unavoidable. Even if German troops achieved positive destruction ratios, even if they eliminated 2 Soviet tanks for every German tank lost, The Soviets could restore their losses, and Germany couldn't. The Eastern Front was devouring German power faster than it could be renewed. Something had to alter, or the army would simply be eroded to nothingness. Hitler's answer was to ignore Zeitzler's worries and insist that German troops maintain every position. Strategic pullbacks were prohibited. Commanders who withdrew without approval faced court-martial. The outcome was a sequence of sieges throughout late 1943 and early 1944 as Soviet troops isolated German units that had been ordered to remain firm. Entire corps were annihilated, protecting positions that had no strategic importance simply because withdrawal was banned. By the end of 1943, German troops had been forced back to approximately the same lines they had occupied in the summer of 1941 before Operation Barbarossa commenced. 2.5 years of combat, millions of casualties, and Germany was back where it began, except now protecting instead of assaulting, outnumbered instead of dominant, withdrawing instead of progressing. And the Soviets were readying something extraordinary. Throughout the winter and spring of 1944, Soviet troops executed a series of assaults that kept German troops unbalanced across the entire front. Leningrad was relieved in January after a blockade of 900 days. Soviet troops advanced into the Baltic states, into Belarus, into Romania. German reconnaissance detected the accumulation of massive Soviet backups in Belarus, opposite Army Group Center, but evaluations varied on Soviet plans. Some officers thought the primary Soviet summer offensive would occur in Ukraine, toward the oil fields of Romania. Others believed the Baltics to isolate Army Group North. Few thought the Soviets would hit Army Group Center, which held robust protective positions in the woods and marshes of Belarus. They were mistaken. Operation Bagration, initiated on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, became the most devastating single defeat in German military annals. Soviet troops committed 1.7 million soldiers, 32,000 artillery guns, 5,000 tanks, and 6,000 planes to the annihilation of Army Group Center. The assault commenced with guerrilla strikes that severed German supply lines throughout Belarus. German leaders lost communication with their units within hours. When Soviet artillery commenced firing, the barrage was so fierce that whole German divisions stopped existing as structured formations. Soviet penetration methods had been perfected over 2 years of offensive actions. Enormous artillery focuses wiped out German forward spots. Tank armies broke through the fragmented defenses before German backups could respond. Mobile groups sped into German rear zones, blocking escape paths, surrounding entire corps. Within a week, Army Group Center had ceased to function as a unified combat force. Within a month, Soviet troops had progressed 350 miles, freeing all of Belarus and advancing into Poland. German losses in Operation Bagration surpassed 300,000 men, greater than the casualties at Stalingrad. 28 divisions were utterly destroyed. The complete German protective front in the center fell apart. Soviet troops reached the Vistula River within reach of Warsaw. In the south, concurrent Soviet assaults into Romania and the Balkans compelled Germany's leftover allies to capitulate or change allegiances. By August 1944, Romania had switched sides, granting the Soviets entry to the ploughed oil fields that had powered the German war apparatus. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most adept defensive leaders, examined the ruins of the Eastern Front in the late summer of 1944 and determined that the war was lost from a military perspective. Soviet troops now outnumbered German troops by ratios that made protection unfeasible. Soviet manufacturing outpaced German manufacturing in every sector. Soviet operational expertise equaled or exceeded German abilities, and Soviet backups appeared endless. For every Soviet army eliminated, 2 more emerged. Heinrici, like many German officers by this stage, realized that the issue was no longer if Germany would lose, but how much of Germany would be seized by Soviet troops when the war concluded. The Western Allies had invaded Normandy in June. Germany now confronted a genuine two-front war with foes advancing from east and west at the same time. The only sensible military path was to pursue peace terms, to save what was left of German troops to avoid complete ruin. But Hitler would not consider peace terms. The war would persist until triumph or obliteration. German troops would battle to the last soldier. Cities would be protected to the last round. The German populace would die rather than yield. The separation between military facts and political direction had become total. In January 1945, Soviet troops launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, the ultimate grand operation that would transport them to Berlin. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers attacked across a 400-mile front. German protections, diminished by years of wearing down, by the redirection of troops to combat the Western Allies, by the loss of seasoned soldiers and gear, crumbled within days. Soviet tank armies progressed up to 30 miles per day, traversing Poland in 3 weeks, arriving at the Oder River, Germany's final major natural hurdle before Berlin, by early February. German officers observing the Soviet progress comprehended that they were seeing military strengths that outdid anything in military records. The scope of Soviet operations, the rapidity of their advances, the organization across multiple fronts, the pure volume of soldiers and equipment they could deploy surpassed what any prior military had accomplished. The Red Army of 1945 had no likeness to the Red Army of 1941. It had been shaped in the furnace of the most savage war in history, had learned from its setbacks, had adjusted and developed, and had arisen as perhaps the most potent military force ever gathered. Guderian, now chief of the General Staff after Zeitzler's mental collapse, conferred with Hitler in March 1945 to talk about the protection of Berlin. Soviet troops were 50 miles from the capital. German troops in the east had been reduced to pieces. There were no backups, no fluid forces, no prospect of halting the Soviet progress. Guderian advised pursuing terms, concluding the war before Berlin was ruined. Hitler dismissed him from command. The ultimate Soviet assault against Berlin started on April 16, 1945. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, backed by more than 6,000 tanks and 41,000 artillery guns, attacked the leftover German troops defending the routes to the capital. German opposition, though frantic, was useless. Soviet troops surrounded Berlin by April 25th. Hitler took his own life on April 30th. Germany capitulated unconditionally on May 8th. From the instant the final broadcasts from Stalingrad fell silent to the ultimate capitulation in Berlin was 27 months. In that period, Soviet troops had forced German armies back over 1,500 miles from the Volga to the Elbe. They had ruined more than 600 German divisions. They had freed vast areas, multiple nations, millions of individuals. The magnitude of the accomplishment was astounding. German generals in the years following the war labored to clarify what had transpired. Many attributed fault to Hitler's meddling, his denial to permit retreats, his demand on retaining indefensible spots. Others highlighted Germany's strategic overstretch, the unfeasibility of waging a multi-front war against foes with superior assets. Some recognized that they had basically misjudged Soviet strengths, Soviet toughness, Soviet resolve. But the fact was simpler and more alarming. German strategic planning had been founded on presumptions about Soviet frailty that were never accurate. The notion that the Soviet Union would crumble after a few decisive blows. The certainty that Soviet manufacturing ability was restricted. The presumption that Soviet troops lacked the expertise for complex operations. Every presumption had been incorrect. And when facts contradicted those presumptions, when Soviet troops continued progressing after Stalingrad, when they exhibited strengths that shouldn't exist, German leaders had no structure for comprehending what they were confronting. They had anticipated the Red Army to shatter. Instead, it had grown more robust, with each clash. They had anticipated Soviet manufacturing to stumble. Instead, it had quickened. They had anticipated Soviet operations to stay rough and foreseeable. Instead, Soviet troops had mastered operational craft at a level that equaled or surpassed German strengths. The astonishment wasn't just that Germany was failing. The astonishment was realizing that the adversary they believed they comprehended was something completely distinct, something much more powerful, something that had absorbed, adjusted, and strengthened even as it endured devastating casualties. In the conclusion, what German generals uttered when they observed the Red Army was still progressing after Stalingrad was less significant than what they didn't utter, what they couldn't utter, what the proof made indisputable, but military arrogance made hard to confess. They had been battling an adversary they never genuinely comprehended.